But how can you say you're anti-oppression, anti-hate, anti-marginalization, then you turn around and become someone who perpetuates oppression, hate, marginalization against other people? I would be a hypocrite. You know, how can you say you want freedom for Black people, but you're ignoring half the community?
In our fast-paced world, it's easy to get swept up in the currents that surround us. But we are the authors of our own life story, and we are infinitely capable of creating the change we want to see within us and beyond. Welcome to Shaping Freedom, a show where we explore and share practical ways to cultivate extraordinary life experiences. I'm your host, Lisane Basquiat. I'm a teacher, entrepreneur, and life strategist. After a career as a corporate executive, I embarked on my own path of entrepreneurship and focused on the human and spirit connection. I come from generations of trailblazing entrepreneurs, artists, healers, and champions of human dignity. Today, I have the unique opportunity to explore how to find love, not only in yourself or your community, but in society at large. Today, I get to sit down with journalist, poet, writer, and activist Kevin Powell. His work for the Black community as a documentarian is something that would strike a chord in anyone listening, regardless of their cultural or ethnic background. His work also means enough to enough people that he was recently nominated for a Grammy for Best Spoken Word Poetry Album, Grocery Shopping with My Mother. This conversation was simply too powerful to leave as a single discussion. So in order to capture the full scope, we're breaking this one down into two parts. And this is part one. Grocery Shopping with My Mother is far beyond a retelling of a simple chore done as an act of love to the woman who raised Kevin. Instead, he uses this framework as a way to explore in a very ethereal way the possible answers to questions that we also discussed during our conversation. We talked about things such as, who is Kevin Powell? Where is he from? And who is this woman who raised this king? And how can one connect to the true meaning of finding love in a society that sometimes feels heartless? And how can Black men shake the shackles of toxic masculinity amid a society filled with violence, hatred, and a systemic disregard for their own humanity? I was warmed by this interview for days, and I know that you'll also appreciate Kevin's beautiful words, his real talk, his wisdom, and his authenticity. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Kevin Powell. Okay, so I am super excited to have the incredible privilege and honor of having a conversation today with you, Kevin Powell.
Thank you.
We've been orbiting, I was just saying that we had been orbiting around each other for a couple of years now. And I'm really excited that we're finally getting a chance to talk, actually in a very public conversation.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And it's my honor. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So Kevin, I'll start off. We were both getting ready to get into a quick chat about this year, and I think we can slide back into that in a minute. But what I first wanted to do is congratulate you for your Grammy nomination on your spoken word, spoken poetry album.
It's wild. It's wild. It's wild for so many reasons. I was running to make this on time because I was at the gym working out with a Brooklyn friend of mine, and he asked me who my favorite writer was. I said Langston Hughes, and he started reciting Langston Hughes poetry. And if you'd have told me when I was a young poet coming up, I was born and raised in New Jersey, but I lived in New York and Brooklyn longer than anywhere else at this point. And I was a part of the New Yorican Poets Cafe scene. You're a New Yorker, you know what I'm talking about.
I'm a New Yorker, and I happen to be a Norican as well.
Exactly.
Yes.
You know that.
Yeah.
Boricua and Haitian. That's right.
That's right.
And so, to come through all of that, I found out just a couple of weeks after I got the Grammy nomination that I was actually the first poet ever on MTV when I read poetry on MTV's The Real World, the first season, which I was like, really? No way. You know what I'm saying? But they said, yeah, there wasn't any poetry before that. And so it's just deep to me it's an incredible opportunity. My mother, I told her about it because I was trying to explain to my mother. She understands in general terms what a Grammy is, but you know what my mother said, of course, like most mamas of color or mamas, period. Does that mean you gonna get some money out of this? I said, I don't know, mom, the money out of this, but I know I got nominated. She said, okay, well,
Yeah.
let me know when you get paid for it. I'm like,
Mm.
okay,
That's the barometer for what's for a good thing. Yeah. So it's
yeah,
called Grocery Shopping with My Mother. Share with us a little bit about that. I know that the work the project is also dedicated to your mom. So maybe tell us a
yeah.
little bit about that. How did you come to creating that project?
My mother got sick about 5 years ago, and I live in Brooklyn. She lives in my hometown in Jersey City, and still. And I said, well, mom, what do you need? She said, I need to take me grocery shopping, and I wasn't thinking about a poetry book. I wasn't thinking about a poetry album. I wasn't even thinking about that title. I just started posting on social media that I was grocery shopping with my mother because it was just she was sick, and I didn't know what was going to happen to her, and I was terrified of losing my mother. Thankfully, she's here. She just made 80 years old.
Oh, congratulations to her.
Thank you. August 28th, she turned 80, which is incredible. And she, I would walk behind her in the grocery store, a shop right in Jersey City, and I literally sometimes would be crying, just
Mm.
like, God, please, ancestors, please protect my mom. Please don't let anything happen to her. And she didn't know any of this, but I'm a vegan. I've become a vegan through the years. I'm very, very much about health and wellness, as we've exchanged notes about that. And, I would try to say to my mother, like, man, can you please not get everything that has so much sugar and salt? And of course, she would tell me to mind my business. And being the Christian woman she is, that we include a lot of curse words in there. You know what I'm saying? He said, I'm going to show you how you can reverse the diabetes, deal with the high blood pressure and your arthritis. My mother said, that sounds great. Uh-huh. And when we got outside on Eastern Parkway, she said, I don't care what that MF said. He's not going to F and tell me what to do. I'm going to eat whatever F I want, F him, F all of that. And I was like, that's my mother. But that's where the book started. It started with social media posts. Grocery shop my mother. And other people started talking about their mothers. And people would talk about the mothers that weren't here anymore. People would talk about the relationships they didn't have with their mothers. It was just profound. And it slowly made its way into a long poem from my mother, modeled after how Seeley from The Color Purple wrote the Dear God letters in that book.
Hmm.
And that's how it happened. And if you'd told me 5 years ago, I'd have a Grammy nomination for an album cover that features my mother, I was like, there's no way this is going to happen, but here it is. So it's just the universe. That's all I can say. It's the universe. It's divine. And I'm just really humble and grateful. We got to take care of our mental, physical, and spiritual. It's so, so important.
Yeah, and it's also, I think that that's part of one of the things that for me is so important is that we focus on and understand our part and contribution to the
Yes.
legacy of our families, to the legacy of our communities, and, really keeping that question front and center within ourselves about like, what are we doing? How are we contributing
Yeah.
to our community? And ensuring that what we're doing is helping to move things forward
That's right.
and bring some comfort and quality to the community versus pulling away from it. You know,
That's right.
one of the reasons why I really wanted to speak with you, Kevin, and a few people have said, including Billy, who is your publicist and also mine. It's incredible
Yes.
how many synchronicities there are between us. People keep saying you two should talk because you both have this real commitment to family and to
Hmm.
culture and to Black people. And so one
Hmm.
of the reasons that I really wanted to have this conversation with you is because during this year of the Hip Hop 50th,
Yes.
and during this year of you having been nominated for the Grammy, I wanted to talk to you about your role models. Like, what is it that led you as a Black man to start to focus on the ways that we're showing up in this world? What led you to focus on, on hip hop and to say some of the things that you're saying and to take the stance that you're taking?
Hmm. Wow. Um, I'm going to be on my toes on this interview. You asked very thoughtful questions. My mother. My mother's the first teacher, the first leader I ever met. My mother has a eighth grade education. She migrated from the South Carolina, up to Jersey. I mean, folks either came from the West Indies or Puerto Rico, or down south and landed in New York and New Jersey. But she instilled in me at an early age, 2, 3 years old, that she started teaching me things. She was very serious about making sure I got the education she wasn't able to get. I mean, she was a victim of segregated America, that she had to deal with the racism, the sexism, and the classism as a poor Black woman coming up. And then all of a sudden, here she is with a child, a young child, born in the middle of the civil rights movement in the '60s. That was my life, and so it was her. She pushed me hard. She was, as a child, I didn't know that I was an artist, a creative. Those words didn't exist around me at the time, but I actually drew before I started writing as a kid. I don't know if you knew that. I was my favorite artist as a child was actually Salvador Dali, and probably because of all the dreams that I had, and I was fascinated by his work in grammar school. So I drew a lot. But my mother took me to the library when I was 8 years old, and I fell in love with books, and that's how the writing started to begin to filter into my head by the time I was in my teenage years. And I honestly did not know, and I say this all the time. I love all people. I don't care what your identity or identities are. I love all human beings. My work is about, you know, empowerment of folks, and truth telling for sure, and challenging all systems and of isms and phobias, all of that. But I didn't know that. I didn't know. I grew up with Black and Puerto Rican folks in Jersey City, so I knew I was Black. I knew folks were Puerto Rican. Yo hablo español, because I learned it from my Puerto Rican friends on the streets in Jersey City, and watching Sesame Street and Electric Company, and hearing the music come through the walls of our apartments, because we lived together. As you know, in New York, Black and Puerto Rican folks literally, our family is very,
Yeah.
very unique dynamic with us. Literally, in your situation, it is family. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
I just knew that I was a very introverted child. I was very shy. I was very socially awkward. But I knew that I was feeling something wasn't right about the world, even as a kid. Like, why are we poor? Why do we have to live in certain places? Why are there rats and roaches, etc.? But it wasn't until I got to college in the '80s and stumbled into the anti-apartheid movement, read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I'm sure you remember Howard Beach happened in New York, and
Oh, I remember.
Benson Hurst. Oh yeah, that was actually the first article I ever got paid for. I was all 20 years old, and I wrote about what happened to Michael Griffith and Howard Beach. And in the midst of all of that, I mean, it was the '80s, and so hip hop was exploding, as you said. My nickname is Kepo, Kepo, Kevin Powell. I used to tag on walls. I used to be at, oh my God, Funhouse, Latin Quarters, Rooftop, Danceteria. I was at all the clubs. It wasn't really until I got to the early '90s that I started to say, okay, I'm a part of something that's bigger than me. It really was when Quincy Jones started Vibe magazine in 1992, but all those things before were planting the seeds. And I, man, oof, you and I were texting at the Rock the Bells 50th anniversary of hip hop in Queens back in, was it August? It was in August,
That
right?
was in August. Yeah, that was a
Yeah.
long day. That was
Oh my
a
God.
beautiful day of
Yes.
music.
Yeah.
Wow, it's like 12 hours in the blazing sun, but it
It
was
was
amazing.
incredible.
It was so good.
Yeah.
So good.
And I was a part, I grew up with, I mean, the first hip hop concert I ever went to was Dougie Fresh when he had a Jerry curl afro and gazelle glasses on. And Slick Rick was still known as MC Ricky D. This was at the Funhouse, and they debuted a song called Lottie Dottie. I was there.
Mm,
I was literally there.
mm.
And it's like, and I think about it now, it's just, we didn't know that we were part of history. And especially if you grew up in the New York, New Jersey area, you literally were watching this thing being incubated. African Americans, West Indians, Puerto Ricans who created this thing called hip
That's
hop.
right.
And it's wow, 50 years later, you're like, we did this. Like these Black and brown kids created this thing that is now all over the world. So it's mind blowing. And to be a small part of it as a writer, as a participant, as a hip hop has just been like, this whole year has been wild to me. And then to get a Grammy nomination, because I mean, before there was hip hop, there was the Last Poets, Nikki Giovanni, all the New Yorican poets like, Mikey Miguel Pinheiro, people like that. And so I come out of all of that. Like this Grammy for me, this nomination and my life as a hip hop head goes to all the folks who came before me. I'm so clear about that. Like there's no me without all those Black, American, West Indian, Puerto Rican folks who made this culture happen for us.
But there was such an energy. It's funny, like you said, it was kind of happening around all of us, but we didn't know what was going to happen, but you could feel it. There was something in the energy of the air that
Yeah.
felt different. It felt kind of electric.
Yeah. It was electric. So it was all those things that were happening that really, it was shaping us. And then it was the Reagan era, it was so much stuff happening in the '80s that just really, it blew my mind. I didn't know. I remember coming home from winter for my first break, and I told my mother, "Oh, I'm going to be a writer." Because my yearbook actually says I'm going to be an accountant when I graduate from high school. And she looked at me like I was out of my mind. She said, "Hey, what?" all these years later, she tells people, my son writes books. He has 16 books. She brags about it. But back then, she was like, you're crazy. She was like, you need to get a real job. And you know, a real
Yeah,
job was go work at UPS, get a job at,
exactly. Working
yeah.
for somebody, getting a steady paycheck every Friday. And
Yeah. Wow. You're taking me back. Wow.
my sister and I hosted a panel discussion
Mm,
where Dougie Fresh, Yo-Yo,
mm.
and Rhapsody and Ari Melber moderated it. And Dougie Fresh beatboxed for my granddaughter. And
Wow.
folks were saying to her, like, do you know what this means? The fact that got Dougie Fresh to beatbox for you, which is really beautiful. And
Yes.
she was mesmerized by it. And I don't think she understands, but we have the video so that we can show it to her as we continue to talk to her about it. I
Wow.
really love the fact that this thing that was happening 50 years ago has turned into something that where there are all these people who are my age contemporaries who did this thing that was kind of like a street culture kind of thing and music that was treated as a very underground thing for so long. I love the fact that, it's now made 50 years of impact on the world and has really spoken the story of the experience of those folks that hip hop speaks to,
That's
which
right.
is I think for me one of the most profound things about hip hop.
I
Um,
agree.
yeah. One thing I know that you talk a lot about is the experience of Black men in this country, the ways that Black men interact with and communicate with each other, and also how men and women communicate with each other. It almost seems like you have created for yourself this ability to model something really interesting and really profound and deep, and like you have through your own life made some decisions that no, you weren't going to go down this more standard or traditional path of like going to work for UPS or one of those things. You're going to be a creative and you're going to speak your heart. So can you talk a
Wow.
little bit about that? Like where does that come from?
Women, women, folks who identify as women. I can't take credit for it. My mother, you know, my mother was deeply affected by my father. They were married, but I saw my father two or three times until I was 8 years old, as I've written about and spoken about many times. And then one rainy day, we went to a drugstore where there was a payphone back before they had Androids and iPhones, right? And she called my father asking, "Can you help us? Can you help us?" And on this particular day, my father said to my mother, pardon me, you lied to me. He's not my son. And cursed her out and hung up the phone. Never heard from him again. I never saw him again. And, so my mother would say, oh, she was deeply affected by it. And, I had this conversation a while ago with Yana Van Zandt, maybe a couple weeks ago, actually, where, you know, um, because of my own years of going to therapy, I had to learn how to forgive my father, but also forgive my mother because she didn't have the emotional tools to process what happened to her. I mean, how do you,
Mm,
if you come from a background where you barely get a formal education, how do you process racism and sexism and classism? She was so profoundly hurt. She would say, "Don't be like your father," but she didn't know what to say. What I should be like, you know what I
mm,
mean? She did the best she could, and honestly, if we're real about it, this country was not just founded on racism; it was founded on sexism. They didn't say all men and women are created equal.
that's
They
right.
said all men, and they were talking about working, wealthy white males, slave masters, slave owners, and they weren't even talking about poor whites or anyone else, and certainly not women of any background. I didn't understand these things, and so I get to college. The first, as I mentioned earlier, reading Malcolm X's autobiography, studying Malcolm, taught me the power of self-reflection. It taught me the power of constantly reinventing yourself and not being afraid to tell the truth. And so I was literally trying to figure out how to be a man without knowing how to be a man, honestly.
Mm,
And I can say this to you, just like I've said it to Ilyasa Shabazz. I've said it to Bernice King, whose father's, as you know, is Dr. King. I would look to people, who are famous, your brother, other men out there who are out there just trying to glean something, you
mm,
know, that could help me to mold this thing as I was 18, 19, 20, 21, 25, because I didn't know. I had no clue, you know. And I read a lot of male writers. I certainly read Malcolm, read Langston. As I mentioned, I read James Baldwin, I read Richard Wright, Mary Baraka. The only woman writer I read during my 4 years at Rutgers University in college was Zora Neale Hurston. There I was watching God. Other than that, I was basically perpetuating or continuing the very sexist, patriarchal, misogynistic education I had gotten since I was a child in kindergarten going forward. Because as you know, where are women and girls, in our education, in math and science and literature and history, absent for the most part. You know what I mean? And it wasn't until I moved across the river from Jersey into New York. And here I am, at this point, because I made a conscious decision when I was 18. I'm going to be a writer, an artist. I'm going to be an activist. I'm going to fight for social justice, and I'm going to be an artist. But I was only fighting racism. That's all I was doing. You know what I mean? I was very disrespectful to women. I was disrespectful to women at Rutgers University. I was disrespectful to women in the community. And as you know, to this day, you can go on social media and see a lot of folks who call themselves so-called woke, aware, conscious, whatever they call themselves, brothers, who have no respect for women and girls at all. You know what I mean? And I was one of those people. I was challenged to read two women that blew my mind. One was Audre Lorde, rest in peace. And the other was Bell Hooks, who became like my mentor, sister, mother figure, friend for half my life until she died 2 years ago. And I actually went to Kentucky as she was dying in hospice in her home and to say goodbye. And reading them and Angela Davis and Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Sonia Sanchez and a wide range of women was the beginning of the opening of my brain. Now, it didn't happen easily.
We have to take a quick listen from the wonderful people who make Shaping Freedom a reality. But when we come back, we'll continue to contemplate how we can more positively contribute to this world that we are all sharing. Welcome back to Shaping Freedom. I'm Lisane Basquiat. In this episode, I am speaking with poet, artist, and activist Kevin Powell about how to love in an uncaring society. When we left off, we were highlighting the dichotomies of treating women one way and men the other, and how we are all helped when we are willing to be more conscious of how we're showing up. Here's the rest of our conversation.
But how can you say you're anti-oppression, anti-hate, anti-marginalization, then you turn around and become someone who perpetuates oppression, hate, marginalization against other people? I would be a hypocrite. How can you say you want freedom for Black people, but you're ignoring half the community? You know what I mean? And so it was a real grappling that was happening with me. Now keep in mind, while I was going through this in 91, 92, Dee Barnes got beat up by Dr. Dre. You know what I mean? While I was going through this, there was other stuff that was happening inside this community that we call hip hop. Famously, I interviewed Tupac Shakur several times when I was at Vibe magazine, wrote 3 cover stories that included him, a 4th for Rolling Stone. When he died, Pac was accused of sexual assault. This all was happening all about me. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I navigate this space that I grew up in, the Black community in general, but also hip hop, and then this country. I realized, what Bell Hooks said to me and Gloria Steinem said to me, who's a dear friend as well, is that sexism is not going to end until we men help to make it end. And you guys can't keep coming around women and girls talking about this. You have to go work with the men and boys. That was a challenge. And eventually over time, it wasn't just racism and sexism. Again, I began to realize, because I am an artist, wait a minute, Kevin, there's also homophobia, there's transphobia. You know what I mean? You can't support any of this stuff, And so it was a journey. It wasn't something that happened overnight. We're talking about 30 years ago where the light switch was turned on. I had years of therapy, years of reading and studying and listening, because men have to learn how to listen to the voices of women. I'm talking especially about so-called cisgendered or heterosexual men, because we are raised to be patriarchs. We were raised with gender privilege. We were raised to believe that manhood, masculinity, is to be hard, tough, don't cry, be violent, certainly be a bully, be abusive, all these different things. But no one ever says that, manhood could be loving and tender, that I used to be ashamed, to even admit that I loved literature as a kid, because I didn't want to be considered soft or corny or something that was less than a man or weak, which is absolutely ridiculous when you think about it, because we put people in what James Baldwin called that male box, that male prison. And I was very much a part of that. And when what happens when you're in that male prison, you become these men who engage in toxic behavior. And I think the final thing for me happened about 20 years ago when the daughter, Shani Baraka, and her girlfriend, her partner, were killed by the husband of their oldest sister. He murdered them because they were young women, and he murdered them because they were lesbians. You know what I mean? It was the saddest funeral I had ever been to in my life. And I remember back then in 2004, I believe it was, I said to myself, I remember watching Ras fall literally. I'm trying not to get emotional thinking about it. If I can envision Ras Barak was not a mayor, as you know, of Newark, New Jersey. It was almost, he nearly fell down in the church. He was so overwhelmed with the sense of that they could not even help their sister, and she's gone, and her girlfriend's gone because this man, this toxic man, had murdered them, had decided they were not fit to live because they were women and they were lesbians. And from that point on, I was like, I'm not going to be silent about racism, nor sexism, nor homophobia, nor transphobia, nor anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ableism, classism, any ism phobia. What Kimberly Crenshaw said is right. We have to see the intersectionality of it all. We've got to challenge it all. And for me, as a privileged man who's heterosexual, cisgender, I can't go anywhere and not talk about these things because I have to challenge this stuff. I have to do it because I realize now what my mother was saying to me when she said, don't be like your father. She was saying you have to be different.
I think a lot of us were told what not to do.
Yeah.
And what I'm really appreciating is that I think we're starting to understand that there's another side to what not to do. Like, okay, we know what not to do, but let's start talking about how to do things differently. Let's start talking about what it is that we actually need to look at and ponder and reflect upon and learn in order to turn the corner to do things differently. As a woman who is in the space of personal growth and empowerment and family legacy, a lot of times folks ask me about, or they make an assumption that my desire is to speak with women only.
Right.
And for me, I think there's no way to speak to one group of people without including the voice of others, even if they are people with whom some of us have not had the best experiences. That's why I interview men as often as I do, because we can't put ourselves into this box where men are here doing their thing and women are there doing our thing. We have to start to talk with each other. We have to start speaking about how we forgive each other and how we get to a place where we have healthier interactions with each other, healthier communication, where we can actually resolve conflict.
Yeah.
Because what's happening, in my observation, is people are kind of running away from each other and trying to create these kind of little isolated boxes, and we're fragmenting as a society because we're all kind of going to these places where we can feel safe. And I think especially within our communities, we really do need to start reaching across to talk to each other and hold each other accountable. And that has nothing to do with what's happening in the broader world. That has nothing to do with any of that. Like, let's right here, right now, start talking about holding ourselves and each other accountable to the ways that we're showing up, encouraging each other and ourselves. Let's start looking at this stuff and figure out how to move forward, because what's happening today is not healthy. Thank you for listening to the first part of my conversation with Kevin Powell. I am deeply moved by his unique perspective on the matters of love, health, and respect for all humans, not just men. You can find his spoken word poetry album, Grocery Shopping with My Mother, wherever you get your albums. It's powerful, it's set to music, and it's something you really don't want to miss. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Shaping Freedom. I'm Lisane Basquiat. You can find more information about Kevin Powell, about Grocery Shopping with My Mother, and his other creative projects in the show notes.